inundated. Pipelines bursting, sewers overrun, now debt threatening to sweep Britain's biggest water company away.
Hello, I'm Sarah Bentley, Thames Water's CEO.
Not anymore.
We've stepped up our leakage activity to help us get back on track this year, but it is going to be a challenge.
It's turned out to be a bigger challenge than Bentley thought. Last night, the chief executive suddenly resigned, leaving the government looking at the prospect of an emergency rescue. The business is currently racing to find a cash injection as it struggles to manage the potential hole in its finances.
Where is the Secretary of State? Literally, one of the largest water companies in Britain potentially is going to go to the wall.
Amid the cost of living squeeze, signs of another consumer crisis heaps more pressure on the government.
Leaks are leading to water shortages, sewage dumping pollutes our rivers, our lakes, our seas, and the only thing on the up is debt at £60 billion.
I am the Water Minister, and the Secretary of State has full confidence in her Minister in sending them to the dispatch box. Just for information, debt to equity fell last year by 4% in the water industry, actually making it more resilient, Mr. Speaker.
But higher up the pecking order, there was more anxiety, though the details were a tad patchy and unclear.
Well, I'm very concerned. Obviously, this is a commercially sensitive situation, and I know that my colleagues across government are looking at what we can do. I don't know too much about what the plans are going to be. I was concerned to hear that the CEO had resigned abruptly.
Well, I think what we've got here is the most extreme example of regulatory failure of the water industry. You've got a company that has mounted up debt. When it was privatised, the industry was almost debt-free. They've paid out huge amounts in dividends to shareholders, and yet we've been seeing sewage pumped into our rivers, bill payers hit with higher prices. But this is symptomatic of the wider sector.
The company is owned through a complex series of structures by some of the world's most powerful pension and sovereign wealth funds, including the Canadian pension funds, BT's pension fund, and the Chinese and Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund. Since privatisation, it has accumulated £14 billion of debt. In total, the water industry has borrowed £60 billion, while paying out a larger £66 billion in dividends.
Regulators are there in industries like that, in natural monopolies, to protect the public interest. And I think it's very hard today to say that the public interest has been protected.
The Chancellor summoned regulators across 5 key industries into Downing Street, warning them companies need to treat their customers fairly and support them as financial pressures pile up. There was talk of securing agreements, reviews and reports into better competition. But much of the detail wasn't new, and Thames Water's ability to stay afloat will be critical in keeping the reputation of Britain's regulators on course.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Mel Stride, who was out encouraging parents on universal credit to take up new enhanced childcare payments, which, starting today, go up by almost 50% for those eligible. So we started on that, and I began by asking how many people he thinks will benefit from it.
Well, we know we've got 119,000 households who are already in receipt of that kind of arrangement. So, of course, potentially that could make a big difference to them. We would hope that there will be tens of thousands more who will get involved in this offer because it's now much more generous. So we are increasing the maximum amount available for support for childcare if you're receiving universal credit by 47%. So it's a huge increase. And we're also tackling one other thing, which is one of the barriers to getting involved in the childcare support has been having to pay the upfront payment in the first month. And we're providing financial assistance to basically take that problem away.
Everyone is deeply worried about paying for everything right now. And obviously the phrase that has upset a lot of people is Rishi Sunak telling people to hold their nerve. Do you think that was tone deaf?
I think what the Prime Minister was very clearly saying is to underscore the importance of getting inflation down and that it's not easy to do so. There are difficult choices that have to be taken in order for that to happen. But we are absolutely determined to halve inflation by the end of this year.
How?
And that, well, firstly by having the Bank of England using monetary policy and supporting them in that endeavour.
So that's the Bank of England. So what's the government going to do?
So the government firstly has got to have an accommodative fiscal policy that doesn't cut across or pull in the wrong direction against that. The government's also going to have to make sure that public sector salary wage increases are at a sensible level.
So the honest answer is that you want people to feel the pinch even more. You know, you are saying people are going to have real terms pay cuts again because you're not going to be able to meet inflation. And in order to bring inflation down, you need money out of people's pockets.
What we're doing actually is supporting those who are most vulnerable and those who are feeling the squeeze the most. So my department has sent out about 8 million payments. Over this year, it'll be £900 to 8 million low-income households, £150 to 6 million disabled people, £300 in December to pensioners. I put up the benefits generally by 10.1% in April. Pensions went up by 10.1%.
So you've got a benefit system that helps people at the bottom, but for most people, they're going to be worse off. It's going to be more falls in living standards. That's how you deliver.
So how we deliver
falling inflation, which, by the way, you're not really delivering at the moment.
So falling inflation is key to delivering for everybody because it affects all of us. So if we can get, and I'm confident that we can, inflation to halve over the year, that will be the single most important act that we can achieve as a government.
The other big economic problem today is the utilities. Thames Water might be going bust. Privatisation has been a disaster, hasn't it?
No,
these things.
I disagree.
The privatisation of Thames Water is an absolute disaster.
No, I don't think it has been an absolute disaster. And in fact, if you look at the security of supply, it's much more secure than it was if you go back to the days when it was nationalised. Now, that's not the same thing as saying there aren't significant challenges going forward, and that's why we have given Ofwat powers to make sure that if dividends are being paid, they're not being paid on the back of environmental damage.
But they are, in fact. Billions have been paid in dividends, and billions have been taken on in debt, none of which existed before.
But the second point that I was going to make was that there is a very clear plan, as you will know, £56 billion worth of investment over the coming period, to make sure that we get on top of, across the sector, the issues of sewage discharges.
But the taxpayer is going to take a massive hit if Thames Water goes under. It's billions in debt, and a small number of people have become very wealthy because of it.
Well, I don't think it would be right for me to be drawn into commenting on an individual private company.
As Rishi Sunak's biggest cheerleader, do you really think it's working?
I think he inherited an extraordinarily difficult and tough challenge. And in those circumstances, I think what you need to look to in a leader is who is the best person that has the best chance of bringing us through this in the most favourable way. And I still remain to this day very clearly of the opinion that that is him, and we will do our absolute best to deliver on his priorities, getting the inflation down, getting growth going, getting the debt down, getting the NHS waiting lists down, and stopping those boats on the immigration front. And that's what we're focusing on delivering.
I mean, because you said the list, I have to point out that that list is not going well. You haven't stopped the boats, you're not getting inflation down.
Okay.
You're not getting the debt down. You're not cutting NHS waiting lists. It's all going wrong.
Well, you mentioned. Well, no, you mentioned the boats. Not all going wrong actually, because we've seen a 20% reduction in the numbers coming across the short Dover Straits, whereas across Europe we've seen a 30% increase. We've seen where we've done a deal.
Not recently.
Hold on a minute. With Albania, where we've done the deal for returning people to Albania, we've seen a 90% plus drop in the number of Albanians coming across and making that very dangerous journey in which, very sadly, people are dying in the process. And I want to see an end to that. And we are making progress, and there's a court judgment, as you know, around the Rwanda policy. Let's see where we are at the end of the year. But my view is we are making progress.
Mel Stride, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is Labour MP Darren Jones, who chairs the Business and Trade Select Committee. Let's come to Thames Water. What should the government do?
Well, if Thames Water goes bust, the government's going to have to take it over, but that's an outrageous outcome because Thames Water should never have been in this position in the first place had there been adequate regulation of their conduct.
Right. I mean, Labour's policy used to be to nationalise water, then it's not anymore because you said it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. If the business is bust, you may as well nationalise it.
Well, we'll have no choice but to bring a business back into public
With no
ownership.
intention of it going private again.
Well, it depends entirely on the nature of the business and whether it's a viable commercial concern. But you're right to highlight that where companies are too important to fail and taxpayers are asked to underwrite them with a blank cheque, there should be much stronger regulation about the way in which senior executives and shareholders run those businesses, which has clearly not happened here.
But the government taking it over will cost a fortune for taxpayers, won't it? I mean, it's got massive liabilities.
Yeah, this is why it's sickening, because this has already happened in the energy market last year. It now seems to be happening in the water sector. Ministers have either been asleep at the wheel or they didn't care about the risk in these important sectors, and now taxpayers are bearing the brunt.
Is Thames Water an isolated case, or are there others like it coming down the tracks, do you think?
I don't know is the answer, but I would expect the government now to do a full risk assessment of the sector and other companies that are too important to fail, to be able to be honest with Parliament about what the risks are and therefore what their actions should be.
I mean, has your committee looked at this?
So we looked at the energy market last year and the failings of the energy regulator that led to billions of pounds of exposure to taxpayers. And we highlighted a number of issues about the role of regulators in supervising the conduct of the people running these businesses that walk away with millions of pounds personally and have no consequences for their behaviour whatsoever. It seems to me that there are very similar issues now in the water sector.
Do you think this changes the arguments around nationalisation? I mean, Labour has kind of walked away from it because, I mean, the argument was this is not a good way to spend money. But if the taxpayer is on the hook anyway, it's effectively subsidising a lot of these businesses and they're making, lots of people rich. Doesn't it change the dynamics of that whole argument, make nationalisation slightly more appealing as an argument?
It depends what the argument is. If you said to me, is it proportionate now for the government to borrow hundreds of billions of pounds to nationalise the entire water sector, I would say no, because I think that there are measures that could be taken now to improve the quality of the regulation to ensure that this can't happen in other businesses. And I'd just say that for people that think that nationalisation is a silver bullet, I have oversight of government that owns other organisations. The Post Office is one example. And the government owning things doesn't mean those businesses are going to be run well.
What about sourcing out the regulation, which you identify clearly as at fault? I mean, should that be brought into government departments, maybe? Make politicians accountable? Because at the moment, you can blame regulators and we can't do anything about them.
So ministers absolve themselves of responsibility. They say the regulators are independent, nothing to do with them. That is an unacceptable answer when taxpayers are exposed to so much risk. So absolutely the government should be updating the requirements of regulators, improving legislation if they need to give them stronger powers around conduct and supervision. But ministers have to take some responsibility for this.
But should the cabinet minister be responsible for the regulation of water? And how can they be when they're supposedly an independent regulator?
I'm happy.
Maybe that whole system doesn't work.
Well, I'm happy for an independent regulator to do the job. Ministers may not be qualified to do that, but we have to have a much tougher ask of regulators, and ministers have to be accountable for the performance of those regulators. That's the issue. Ministers have said now for many years, they're independent, it's not our problem. That's unacceptable.
I mean, do you think, anyone has been able to sort of actually take a sort of a more strategic view of these utilities that are effectively privately owned monopolies in a lot of cases?
Well, the regulators were set up originally when the utilities are privatised to, have the consumer's interest at heart because there's not competition. The regulators.
But economic hardship has exposed the extent to which they just don't work for consumers.
No, exactly. But I do believe we can fix it. So when we looked at the energy sector last year, there were clear things the energy regulator could do to run the sector better. And we've made a lot of progress doing that. But it shouldn't be coming from parliamentary committees like mine. It should be coming from ministers. Ministers have been meeting today with regulators. But where's the action plan? This cumulative risk has built up in key utilities over many, many years. And they have to step in and deal with it.
I mean, we saw Jim McMahon for Labour asking a lot of questions today. Are there Labour answers?
Well, the Labour answer is that you must do that regulatory work first before you even think about exposing yourself to hundreds of billion pounds of additional debt for the government.
But this looks like a sort of a sudden problem. I mean, if he was the cabinet minister, well, you want to kind of know what would he do to sort it out?
Sure, but it shouldn't have been a sudden problem. Ministers should have known this was a problem. Thames Water, for example, has been in very high levels of debt for many, many years, has taken out enormous dividends for many, many, many years, has rewarded their executives very handsomely for many, many years. This should not have been a surprise either to the regulators or to ministers. It's because they weren't paying attention.
Darren Jones, thank you very much.